The quiet neighborhood of Maple Street was like a picture from a postcard. The houses, with their quaint picket fences and perfectly manicured lawns, lined both sides of the street. Flowers bloomed in vibrant shades, and the air was filled with the scent of freshly baked bread from the local bakery. But in this seemingly idyllic setting lived a little stray cat named Whiskers. She was not part of any family, nor did she belong to any home. Yet, she belonged everywhere. Whiskers had made her home under the porch of an old, abandoned house on the corner. It wasn't much. A wooden plank or two provided shelter from the rain, and the occasional kind-hearted neighbor left scraps of food. But Whiskers didn't mind. She was small, with soft gray fur and striking amber eyes that seemed to glow, especially when she was curious. And Whiskers was curious about everything. Her days were spent wandering the streets, observing people going about their lives. The baker at the corner shop would often chuckle as Whiskers sat by his door, her nose twitching at the aroma of warm bread. The florist down the street would smile and wave as Whiskers batted at the petals of a fallen daisy. Despite being a stray, Whiskers had a way of weaving herself into the fabric of the community. One particular morning, as the sun rose and bathed Maple Street in golden light, Whiskers found herself lounging on the bakery's sun-warmed steps. It was her favorite spot, especially when the baker was too busy to notice her stealing a quick sniff of the freshly baked loaves. But today, something unusual caught her attention. A bright yellow delivery truck, its sides adorned with the logo of a cheerful smile. The truck parked across the street, and Whiskers tilted her head, watching intently. A burly man in a blue uniform stepped out, whistling a tune. He had a jovial air about him, his movements relaxed yet purposeful. He was greeted warmly by a young woman who ran the cafe next to the bakery. As the two exchanged pleasantries, Whiskers noticed the way the man, Joe, gestured with his hands, the way he laughed. There was something different about him, something that drew her in. As Joe hopped back into his truck and started the engine, Whiskers felt a strange pull. Her heart raced, and her tail twitched. She didn't know why, but she couldn't take her eyes off the truck. It began to move, rolling slowly down the street, and without a second thought, Whiskers leapt off the steps. She landed lightly on her paws and began to follow the truck, her movements quick and agile. At first, she kept a safe distance, darting behind trash bins and parked cars whenever she thought someone might notice her. But as the truck picked up speed, Whiskers found herself running harder and faster, her paws pounding against the pavement. The world around her blurred as she focused all her energy on keeping up. She darted through alleys and leapt over fences, her small frame weaving effortlessly through the obstacles that stood in her path. She didn't understand why she was chasing the truck, but she couldn't stop. It was as if an invisible thread connected her to it, pulling her forward. The streets began to change as the truck moved away from the cozy familiarity of Maple Street. The houses grew taller, the roads busier. The hum of the city replaced the quiet rustle of leaves. Whiskers felt a pang of anxiety. This was territory she had never ventured into before. But her resolve remained strong. As she ran, Whiskers caught glimpses of the truck's interior. The passenger seat held a small, tattered blanket, and a lunchbox with a photo taped to its lid. The photo was of a little girl with curly hair and a gap-toed smile, her arms wrapped around what appeared to be a stuffed animal. The sight stirred something deep within Whiskers, though she couldn't quite place it. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher in the sky. Whiskers' paws began to ache, and her stomach growled in protest. She hadn't eaten since the previous evening, and her body was starting to feel the strain. But the thought of stopping never crossed her mind. She was on a mission, even if she didn't fully understand what it was. As the truck turned onto a quieter road, lined with small shops and cafes, Whiskers noticed people stopping to greet Joe. He seemed to know everyone, and everyone seemed to like him. They waved, they smiled, they laughed at his jokes. Whiskers watched from the shadows, her amber eyes taking in every detail. There was a warmth about Joe that reminded her of the baker or the florist back home, kindness wrapped in a layer of familiarity. But this wasn't home. Whiskers was far from the safety of Maple Street, and for the first time, she felt a pang of uncertainty. What if she got lost? What if she couldn't find her way back? She paused for a moment, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. The truck had stopped at a small cafe, and Joe was unloading boxes. Whiskers crouched low, her tail swishing thoughtfully. She could turn back now. She could return to her porch, her bakery steps, her familiar routine. But then, she thought of the little girl in the photo. She thought of the way Joe laughed, the way he waved to people as if they were all old friends. Something told her this was important, that this journey, however strange and exhausting, was leading her somewhere she was meant to be. With a deep breath, Whiskers straightened up. Her paws ached, her body was tired, but her spirit was stronger than ever. She would keep going. Whatever lay at the end of this road, she was determined to find it. As Joe climbed back into the truck and the engine roared to life, Whiskers took off once again. The road stretched out before her, endless and uncertain, but filled with the promise of something extraordinary. And so, with the sun beating down and her heart pounding in her chest, Whiskers ran, toward the truck, toward the unknown, and toward a future that would change her life forever. The bright yellow truck, with its cheerful logo, rolled down the streets with a steady hum. Whiskers, with her small, nimble frame, darted after it, weaving through the bustling city. The once familiar sights of Maple Street were now replaced by towering skyscrapers, busy intersections, and the cacophony of city life. For a stray cat who had never ventured far from her neighborhood, the scene was both exhilarating and overwhelming. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows on the pavement. Whiskers' paws began to ache as she ran tirelessly, her amber eyes fixed on the truck. Her heart pounded in rhythm with the truck's engine, her determination pushing her forward despite the growing distance from everything she'd ever known. At the first traffic light, the truck came to a halt. Whiskers seized the opportunity to catch her breath, crouching behind a trash bin. Her chest heaved as she licked her paws, trying to soothe the sting from the rough asphalt. She peered out cautiously, her ears twitching. Joe, the delivery driver, leaned out of his window, whistling a tune. His carefree demeanor was a stark contrast to the chaos surrounding him. As the light turned green, the truck roared back to life. Whiskers didn't hesitate. She was on her feet in an instant, her body moving on instinct. She darted between pedestrians and dodged bicycles, her small size allowing her to navigate the crowded streets with surprising ease. But the journey wasn't without challenges. Whiskers found herself in unfamiliar territory, where towering buildings seemed to touch the sky and the air buzzed with noise. The scent of exhaust fumes mixed with the aromas of street food, creating a confusing symphony of smells that made her whiskers twitch. At one point, the truck turned down a narrow alley, and Whiskers hesitated. The alley was dimly lit, its walls covered in graffiti and littered with discarded trash. It was a far cry from the cozy, sunlit streets of her neighborhood, but the sight of the truck's cheerful logo disappearing around the corner reignited her resolve. Whiskers sprinted into the alley, her paws silent against the gritty pavement. The air grew cooler in the shadows, and the faint sound of distant voices echoed around her. She leapt over a pile of crates, narrowly avoiding a toppled can that clattered loudly behind her. Her heart raced as she emerged on the other side, just in time to see the truck merging onto a quieter road. As the hours passed, the cityscape began to change. The towering buildings gave way to smaller shops and residential areas. Whiskers noticed fewer people on the streets, and the air felt cleaner, fresher. Her exhaustion was beginning to catch up with her, but she refused to stop. She passed a park where children played on swings and couples strolled hand in hand. The sight of a young boy offering an ice cream cone to his little sister warmed Whiskers' heart, reminding her of the simple joy she had observed in her own neighborhood. But she didn't linger. The yellow truck was her focus, her goal. Finally, as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the truck came to a stop outside a quaint suburban home. Whiskers crouched behind a bush, her amber eyes peering out as Joe stepped out of the truck, carrying a package. A young girl with curly red hair bounded out of the house, her face lighting up with joy as she greeted Joe. "Mr. Joe!" she exclaimed, her voice filled with excitement. Joe chuckled, ruffling her hair. "Hey, Lily, got something special for you today." Whiskers watched intently as the two exchanged smiles. The scene stirred something deep within her, a longing for connection, for warmth. But she remained hidden, her body pressed low against the ground. As Joe climbed back into the truck and drove away, Whiskers felt a pang of uncertainty. She had come so far, but for what? Her paws ached, her stomach growled, and the once clear purpose of her journey now felt clouded. But something inside her refused to give up. The journey wasn't over yet. Joe's truck led Whiskers to a bustling marketplace. The sun had dipped lower, casting a golden glow over the scene. Vendors called out to passers-by, offering fresh produce, handmade goods, and warm smiles. Whiskers, feeling the ache in her paws and the emptiness in her stomach, paused for a moment. She crouched beneath a fruit stand, her eyes scanning the crowd. The aroma of roasted chestnuts and freshly baked pastries made her mouth water. Her instincts told her to snatch a morsel and retreat to safety, but her gaze drifted back to the truck, now parked at the edge of the market. Joe emerged, carrying a stack of packages. As he moved toward a row of shops, a small boy stumbled into his path. The boy's face crumpled as his ice cream cone tumbled to the ground. Joe knelt down, his kind eyes meeting the boy's tearful ones. "Hey, buddy," Joe said gently, pulling a tissue from his pocket. "No need to cry. Accidents happen." The boy sniffled, and Joe handed him a dollar bill. "Go get yourself another one, okay?" The boy's face lit up, and he ran off toward the ice cream cart. Whiskers observed the interaction with keen interest. Joe's kindness wasn't limited to his deliveries. It extended to everyone he encountered. Whiskers lingered in the shadows of the bustling marketplace, her amber eyes darting from one vibrant scene to another. The colorful stalls brimmed with fruits, spices, and handmade trinkets, each vendor calling out to passers-by with enthusiasm. The smell of roasted chestnuts and freshly baked bread hung heavily in the air, teasing her growling stomach. She crouched beneath a fruit stand, her sharp ears swiveling to catch every sound. Her focus, however, remained on the yellow truck parked at the far end of the market. Joe was busy unloading packages, his broad shoulders shifting easily under the weight of the boxes. Whiskers could hear his hearty laugh even from her hiding spot, a sound so genuine it warmed the cool evening air. As Joe moved toward a row of shops, a small boy ran across the path, clutching an ice cream cone in his hand. The child stumbled on a loose stone, and the cone fell with a splat onto the pavement. The boy's face crumpled, tears welling in his wide eyes. Joe stopped in his tracks, crouching down to meet the boy's gaze. "Hey, buddy," he said gently, pulling a tissue from his pocket. "It's okay. It's just ice cream. We can fix this." The boy sniffled, looking up at Joe with watery eyes. Without hesitation, Joe handed the boy a crisp dollar bill. "Go on, get yourself another one. Maybe even two." The boy's face lit up with a smile, and he scampered off toward the ice cream cart, his earlier sadness forgotten. Whiskers, watching from her hidden spot, felt her heart ache in a way she didn't quite understand. Joe's kindness was so natural, so effortless, and it reminded her of moments she had observed but never been part of. Nearby, a vendor dropped a loaf of bread while arranging his stall. The bread rolled onto the ground, and Whiskers instinctively darted out, snagging it in her mouth before retreating to the shadows. The vendor didn't notice, too busy tidying his wares, and Whiskers felt a pang of guilt. But hunger won out as she tore into the crusty loaf, the warmth of the bread filling her belly and renewing her energy. Joe finished his deliveries and climbed back into the truck, the engine rumbling to life once more. Whiskers hesitated, her paws resting on the cool pavement. She had been following him all day, venturing far beyond the safety of her neighborhood. Was it worth continuing? Her eyes flicked to Joe as he waved to a passing vendor, his grin as bright as a yellow truck he drove. Something about him, his warmth, his generosity, compelled her to keep going. With a soft huff, she leapt back into motion, her paws padding silently behind the truck as it rolled out of the marketplace. The sun dipped lower, painting the horizon in hues of orange and pink. The once bustling streets grew quieter as the day shifted to evening. Whiskers continued her pursuit, her body aching from the relentless chase. Every step was a test of her resolve, her tiny paws tender from the rough pavement. The truck veered onto a quieter road lined with small houses. Whiskers paused for a moment, crouching in the grass by the roadside. She licked her sore paws, her chest rising and falling with each labored breath. The journey was beginning to take its toll, and doubt began to creep into her mind. Why was she following this truck? What was she hoping to find? She thought of the little girl in the photo taped to Joe's lunchbox. The girl's bright smile and the stuffed animal in her arms had left an impression on Whiskers. It wasn't just curiosity driving her. It was a longing she couldn't fully understand. The truck slowed to a stop in front of a modest suburban house. Joe stepped out, carrying a large box toward the front door. Whiskers crept closer, hiding in the shadows of a bush. The door opened, and a middle-aged woman greeted Joe with a warm smile. "Thank you, Joe. You're a lifesaver," she said, taking the package from him. Joe waved off her thanks. "Just doing my job. You take care now." As Joe returned to the truck, Whiskers felt a surge of determination. She had come too far to turn back now. Whatever had drawn her to this journey was still ahead, waiting to be discovered. The truck continued its route, leaving the suburban neighborhood behind and heading into the countryside. The open fields stretched out endlessly, the tall grass swaying gently in the evening breeze. Whiskers found herself mesmerized by the beauty of it all, though her exhaustion was becoming harder to ignore. The truck turned down a dirt road, eventually stopping at a large farmhouse surrounded by barns and fields. Joe stepped out, greeted warmly by an elderly woman with silver hair tied into a neat bun. "Well, if it isn't my favorite delivery man," the woman exclaimed, her voice as warm as her smile. Joe laughed. "Afternoon, Mrs. Miller. Got a special delivery for you today." As the two chatted, Whiskers noticed a faint sound coming from the nearby field. It was a soft, pitiful meowing, barely audible over the rustling of the grass. She tilted her head, her ears swiveling to pinpoint the source. Curiosity got the better of her, and she followed the sound, weaving through the tall grass. She stopped abruptly when she spotted a tiny kitten tangled in a patch of weeds. The kitten, no more than a few weeks old, was trembling and weak. Whiskers' heart ached at the sight. She approached cautiously, her instincts guiding her as she nudged the kitten free from the weeds. The kitten let out a tiny squeak, its big, frightened eyes meeting Whiskers' calm, amber gaze. The kitten clung to her, nuzzling against her fur for warmth. Whiskers felt an unfamiliar but undeniable sense of purpose. She couldn't leave the kitten behind. It needed her. With the kitten tucked safely against her, Whiskers made her way back toward the farmhouse. As she emerged from the grass, Joe and Mrs. Miller turned to look at her. Joe's eyes widened in surprise. "Well, would you look at that?" he said softly. Mrs. Miller knelt down, her kind eyes studying Whiskers and the kitten. "You brave little thing," she murmured, extending a gentle hand. Whiskers hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, the kitten still pressed against her side. Somehow, she knew she had found a place where kindness and love weren't just fleeting moments. They were a way of life. The farmhouse basked in the warm glow of the setting sun, its rustic charm radiating a sense of peace and belonging. Whiskers sat cautiously on the wooden porch, her tail curled protectively around the tiny kitten nestled beside her. Joe and Mrs. Miller stood nearby, their eyes filled with curiosity and tenderness as they observed the unlikely pair. "Seems like she's been following you, Joe," Mrs. Miller said with a chuckle, her gaze never leaving Whiskers. Joe crouched down, his large hands resting on his knees. "And she brought a friend along," he said softly, He extended a hand toward Whiskers, who flinched at first but held her ground. Joe's gentle demeanor seemed to ease her nerves, and she allowed his hand to rest near her, though she didn't yet lean into his touch. Mrs. Miller disappeared inside for a moment and returned with a saucer of milk and a small piece of bread. She placed the offerings a few feet from Whiskers and stepped back. The little kitten stirred, its tiny nose twitching as it caught the scent of food. "Go on, sweetie," Mrs. Miller encouraged. Whiskers hesitated, her instincts warning her to stay cautious. But hunger, and the kitten's soft cries, pushed her forward. She nudged the kitten toward the saucer, and the two began to eat, their movements tentative but desperate. Joe watched with a smile. "You've got a brave heart, little one," he murmured, "running all this way. You're something special." As the evening wore on, Whiskers began to feel a strange sense of safety. The farmhouse, with its cozy warmth and kind inhabitants, was unlike anything she had ever known. For the first time, she didn't feel like an outsider. The next morning, Whiskers woke to the sound of birds chirping and the smell of fresh hay wafting through the air. She stretched her tired limbs, the kitten still curled up beside her. Mrs. Miller's soft humming drifted from the kitchen, and Joe's deep laugh echoed from the barn. Whiskers ventured cautiously into the yard, the kitten tottering behind her. The wide-open space was a stark contrast to the narrow alleys and busy streets she had known. Here, the air was fresh, the ground soft, and the world seemed to move at a slower, gentler pace. As she explored, Whiskers noticed Joe unloading crates from his truck. His movements were steady and deliberate, but his face lit up when he saw her approach. "Morning, little traveler," he greeted warmly. He crouched down, pulling a small piece of jerky from his pocket. Whiskers hesitated but stepped closer, her trust in him growing. She took the offering gingerly, her amber eyes meeting his. Joe's smile widened, and he reached out to scratch behind her ears. This time, Whiskers didn't pull away. The kitten mewed softly, drawing Joe's attention. "And who's this little one?" he asked, gently scooping the kitten into his hands. The kitten nuzzled against his palm, eliciting a chuckle. "You've got a lot of courage for someone so small." Mrs. Miller emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. "Looks like you found yourself some new friends, Joe," she said with a smile. Joe nodded, his gaze shifting between Whiskers and the kitten. "I think they found me," he replied. Life at the farmhouse was idyllic, but nature had its challenges. By late afternoon, dark clouds began to gather on the horizon, and the wind picked up, rustling the trees. Whiskers sensed a change in the air, her instincts alerting her to the impending storm. Joe and Mrs. Miller hurried to secure the barn and bring the animals inside. Whiskers followed them, her sharp eyes scanning the skies. The kitten, frightened by the sudden shift in weather, clung to her side. As the storm rolled in, rain began to pour in heavy sheets, drumming against the roof of the barn. Whiskers curled around the kitten, shielding it from the cold. Joe and Mrs. Miller lit lanterns, their warm glow casting comforting shadows on the walls. "Don't worry," Joe said softly, crouching near Whiskers. "We'll keep you safe." The storm raged through the night, but within the walls of the barn, Whiskers felt a newfound sense of security. Despite the howling wind and crashing thunder, she knew she wasn't alone. When morning came, the storm had passed, leaving the world refreshed and glistening. The sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light over the farm. Whiskers stepped out cautiously, the kitten bounding after her with newfound energy. Joe and Mrs. Miller were already at work, checking for any damage from the storm. Joe waved to Whiskers as she approached. "Good morning, little hero," he greeted, tossing her a piece of bacon from his breakfast plate. Mrs. Miller joined them, kneeling to pet Whiskers. "You brought a special kind of energy to this place," she said warmly. "It's like you were meant to be here." Whiskers purred softly, a sound she hadn't made in years. The bond between her and her new companions grew stronger with each passing day. She began to trust their kindness, finding comfort in their presence. The kitten, now named Clover by Mrs. Miller, became a source of joy for everyone. Its playful antics brought laughter to the farm, and Whiskers watched with pride as Clover grew stronger and more confident. Weeks turned into months, and Whiskers settled into her new life. The farmhouse, once a distant dream, had become her reality. She roamed the fields, basked in the sun, and spent evenings curled up by the fire with Joe and Mrs. Miller. But her journey had left a lasting impact. Whiskers had discovered not just a home, but a purpose. Her determination and courage had brought her to a place of safety and love where she and Clover could thrive. Joe often spoke of how special Whiskers was, how her unlikely journey had touched his heart. She's a reminder that sometimes life takes us on paths we don't understand, he would say. But those paths lead us exactly where we're meant to be. Whiskers couldn't understand his words, but she felt their truth. She had followed a truck, driven by an unexplainable pull, and found a life she never imagined. Her story wasn't just one of survival. It was one of hope, courage, and the unyielding power of connection. The gentle hum of the countryside had become a comforting backdrop to Whiskers' life. The once wary and solitary stray now roamed the farm like its guardian, her amber eyes sharp and watchful, her movements confident and purposeful. Clover, the kitten she had rescued, was her constant companion. Together, they explored every corner of the farm, from the creaky old barn to the wildflower-dotted meadows. Joe and Mrs. Miller had officially welcomed Whiskers and Clover into their lives, treating them as part of the family. Joe often joked, "You two have better instincts than most people I know." His words held truth. Whiskers had proven herself to be more than just a stray cat. She was a survivor, a protector, and now, a beloved member of the farm. One warm afternoon, Joe worked on fixing the fence near the edge of the property. Whiskers and Clover followed him, their curious noses sniffing at the tools and materials he carried. "You keeping an eye on me, huh?" Joe said with a chuckle, scratching behind Whiskers' ears. Clover pounced on a stray nail, batting it across the grass. Joe laughed. "Guess I've got two supervisors now." Mrs. Miller appeared with a tray of lemonade and biscuits, her kind eyes lighting up at the sight of Whiskers and Clover. "I don't know what we did to deserve these two," she said, placing the tray on the fence post. "They've brought so much life to this place." As they sat together, sipping lemonade and enjoying the peaceful afternoon, Whiskers stretched out in the sun, feeling an overwhelming sense of contentment. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. Life on the farm wasn't without its challenges. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Whiskers sensed something unusual. Her ears perked up, and her tail twitched as she scanned the yard. A faint rustling came from the chicken coop, and Whiskers was on her feet in an instant. Clover, though smaller, followed closely behind, her tiny body mimicking Whiskers' alert stance. The two crept toward the coop, their movements silent and calculated. Inside, a fox had managed to squeeze through a gap in the wire, its sharp eyes fixed on the unsuspecting hens. Whiskers let out a low growl, her fur bristling as she stood her ground. The fox turned, startled by the sudden presence of the cats. Clover hissed, her small body puffed up in an attempt to look larger. Together, they created a formidable front, their teamwork forcing the fox to retreat. Joe arrived moments later, drawn by the commotion. He spotted the gap in the fence and quickly secured it. "Looks like you two saved the day," he said, his voice filled with pride. From that day on, Whiskers and Clover became the unofficial protectors of the farm. Their bond grew stronger, their trust in each other unwavering. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were heroes in their own right. One crisp autumn morning, Whiskers sat on the porch, watching the leaves fall from the trees. The air was cool, and the smell of pumpkin pie wafted from the kitchen. Clover was playing with a ball of yarn Mrs. Miller had given her, tumbling across the porch in a flurry of paws and fluff. A familiar sound caught Whiskers' attention, the hum of a delivery truck. She stood, her ears twitching as Joe's yellow truck rolled into the driveway. But something was different. This truck had a new logo on the side and wasn't driven by Joe. Whisker's heart raced as the driver stepped out. It was a young woman with auburn hair and a warm smile. She carried a package to the porch, her eyes widening as she saw Whiskers. "Well, aren't you a pretty one?" she said, crouching down to pet her. Joe stepped out of the house, greeting the driver. "Morning, Sarah. What brings you all the way out here?" Sarah handed him the package. "New delivery route. Just started this week." As they chatted, Whiskers noticed something about Sarah, a faint resemblance to the girl in the photo on Joe's lunchbox. Could it be? Whiskers approached cautiously, her amber eyes studying Sarah. Joe caught the look in Whiskers' eyes and chuckled. "Looks like she's curious about you," he said. Sarah smiled, reaching out to scratch behind Whiskers' ears. "She's a smart one. You're lucky to have her." Whiskers purred, feeling a strange connection to Sarah. She didn't know why, but she felt as if a journey had come full circle. As the seasons changed, the farm prepared for its annual harvest festival. Neighbors and friends gathered to celebrate, bringing food, music, and laughter. Whiskers and Clover were the stars of the event, their stories spreading among the guests. They followed Joe's truck for miles, Mrs. Miller said, her voice filled with pride. And now, they are part of the family. Children played with Clover, tossing yarn and dangling feathers for her to chase. Whiskers watched from a distance, her eyes soft with affection. She had found her place in the world, and it was here, surrounded by love and kindness. Joe stood by the barn, sharing a story with Sarah, who had become a regular visitor to the farm. "You've got a good heart, Joe," Sarah said. "These two wouldn't have made it without you." Joe shook his head. "I think they saved me as much as I saved them." The story of Whiskers and Clover became a symbol of resilience, love, and the unexpected paths life takes. Joe often shared their journey with visitors, his voice filled with emotion. "They remind us that kindness can change lives," he would say. As the sun set over the farm, Whiskers lay beside Clover, watching the horizon. Her journey had been long and filled with challenges, but it had led her to a life she could never have imagined. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of Whiskers and Clover. Their story is a reminder that no matter where life takes us, there's always hope, kindness, and love waiting just around the corner. Have you ever experienced an unexpected journey that changed your life? What's a moment of kindness you've witnessed that made your day brighter? We'd love to hear your thoughts and stories in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Let's spread the message of hope and kindness together.